The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Camilla Parker Bowles adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time in 5 minutes. Today marked her first official military inspection as Queen Consort, a responsibility that had been weighing heavily on her mind for weeks. She stood before her bedroom mirror, practicing her posture and the dignified way she had been rehearsing with her private secretary. "Your Majesty, the car will be ready in 10 minutes, announced Sarah, her lady-in-waiting, as she entered the room with a final briefing folder. Camilla nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. Unlike Charles, who had decades of military experience and natural authority, she felt like an imposter preparing to play a role she never truly wanted. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman once vilified by the British press would now be reviewing troops who had sworn allegiance to the crown. The journey to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst took 45 minutes, during which Camilla reviewed her notes about the ceremony. She would be inspecting the graduating class of officer cadets, a tradition dating back over a century. The young men and women she would meet today represented the future of Britain's armed forces, and they deserved respect and recognition for their dedication. As the royal convoy approached the academy gates, Camilla could see crowds of families and dignitaries gathering for the ceremony. Television crews positioned their cameras strategically, ready to capture every moment of what the media had dubbed Camilla's military debut. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the advice Charles had given her. Just be yourself, darling. They'll see your genuine appreciation for their service. The Academy's commandant, Brigadier James Harrison, greeted Camilla as she stepped from her vehicle. A distinguished man in his 50s with a chest full of medals, he had served in Afghanistan and Iraq before taking on this prestigious posting. His handshake was firm, his smile warm but professional. "Your Majesty, welcome to Sandhurst. We are honored to have you review our graduating class today," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Thank you, Brigadier Harrison. I'm looking forward to meeting these remarkable young officers," Camilla replied, her voice steady despite her inner nervousness. The ceremony began with Camilla taking her position on the reviewing stand, a raised platform decorated with military banners and the royal standard. Below her, 200 officer cadets stood in perfect formation, their uniforms pressed to crisp perfection, their faces serious with concentration. These young people, ranging in age from 18 to 25, had endured a year of rigorous training that tested their physical stamina, mental resilience, and leadership potential. Among them stood Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 23, whose father had served in the Falklands War. She had dreamed of this moment since childhood, inspired by stories of military heroism and service to country. Next to her, Lieutenant David Chun, 24, represented the modern face of Britain's military, the son of immigrants who had found purpose and belonging in the armed forces. As the band began playing the national anthem, Camilla felt a genuine surge of pride watching these dedicated individuals. Their commitment reminded her of her own late father, Major Bruce Shand, who had served with distinction in World War II. Perhaps she wasn't such an outsider to military life after all. The formal inspection began with Camilla walking slowly along the ranks, Brigadier Harrison at her side providing quiet commentary about the cadets' achievements. She paused occasionally to speak with individual officers, asking about their backgrounds and future assignments. Her natural warmth began to shine through the formal protocol, and several cadets later commented on her genuine interest in their stories. "Where will you be posted after graduation?" she asked Lieutenant Mitchell. "Cyprus, Your Majesty. I'll be leading a platoon responsible for base security," Mitchell replied, her voice clear and confident. "That's wonderful. Your family must be very proud," Camilla said, noticing the young woman's obvious dedication. The inspection proceeded smoothly until they reached the final section of cadets. Here, a slight complication arose that would soon escalate into something much more significant. Lieutenant James Weatherby, 22, a young man from an aristocratic family with generations of military service, stood with particular pride in his bearing. His great-grandfather had been knighted for valor in World War I, and his father currently served as a colonel in the household division. Weatherby had been looking forward to this moment with intense anticipation. In his mind, meeting the Queen Consort represented a connection to the very pinnacle of British society and tradition. He had prepared extensively, practicing his salute and researching proper protocol until he could recite the regulations from memory. As Camilla approached his position, Weatherby's excitement got the better of his judgment. Instead of waiting for the appropriate moment to salute, he stepped slightly forward from the line, breaking formation in a way that immediately caught the attention of the drill sergeants positioned around the parade ground. "Your Majesty," Weatherby said, his voice carrying further than he intended, "it is an extraordinary honor to serve under your recognition today." The comment itself wasn't inappropriate, but the timing and delivery violated the strict protocol governing such ceremonies. Cadets were expected to remain silent unless directly addressed by the reviewing officer. Moreover, his phrasing suggested a familiarity that didn't exist and could be interpreted as presumptuous. Camilla, caught off guard by the unexpected interaction, paused in her inspection. She could sense the tension that immediately rippled through the assembled officers and staff. Brigadier Harrison's face remained impassive, but she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated concern. The moment stretched longer than it should have, creating an awkward silence that seemed to amplify across the parade ground. Television cameras captured every second of the interaction, though viewers watching the live broadcast couldn't yet appreciate the significance of what was unfolding. Camilla's first instinct was to respond graciously to the young man's enthusiasm, but she also recognized that how she handled this breach of protocol would set a precedent for future interactions. The military culture depended on discipline and proper channels of authority, and even well-meaning violations could undermine that structure. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said finally, her tone polite, but noticeably cooler than her previous interactions. "I'm sure you'll serve with distinction." She then moved on to the next cadet, but the damage to the ceremony's flow had been done. Weatherby, realizing his mistake, felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had intended to make a positive impression, but instead had created exactly the kind of disruption that military training was designed to prevent. The remainder of the inspection proceeded without incident, but Camilla found herself thinking about the interaction with Weatherby. There was something in his manner that reminded her uncomfortably of the entitled attitudes she had encountered among certain members of the aristocracy throughout her life. His assumption of familiarity struck her as presumptuous, though she recognized that his intentions were probably innocent. After the formal inspection concluded, the ceremony moved to its next phase, the presentation of awards to distinguished graduates. Camilla would be presenting the Sword of Honor to the cadet judged most outstanding by the Academy staff, along with several other prestigious awards recognizing leadership, academic achievement, and physical courage. The winner of the Sword of Honor was Lieutenant Rebecca Stone, 24, whose exceptional performance in all aspects of training had impressed even the most demanding instructors. Stone had overcome significant personal challenges to reach this point. Raised by a single mother after her father's death in a training accident, she had worked multiple jobs to support her education before joining the military. As Stone approached the reviewing stand to receive her award, Camilla felt genuinely moved by the young woman's story. Here was someone who had earned her place through merit and determination, embodying the best qualities the military sought to develop in its officers. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Stone. Your achievements are truly remarkable," Camilla said as she presented the ceremonial sword. "Thank you, Your Majesty. This honor means everything to me," Stone replied, her voice thick with emotion. The moment provided a stark contrast to the earlier awkwardness with Weatherby, reinforcing for Camilla the difference between earned respect and assumed privilege. She made a mental note to learn more about Stone's background and future career plans. Following the awards ceremony, Camilla was scheduled to attend a private reception with senior Academy staff and distinguished guests. This more informal setting would allow for conversations that weren't possible during the formal inspection, giving her an opportunity to learn more about the Academy's role in developing future military leaders. The reception took place in the Academy's historic old college building, its walls lined with portraits of famous graduates who had gone on to distinguished military careers. Camilla found herself in animated conversation with several instructors about the challenges of modern military training and the changing nature of international conflicts. "The young officers we're commissioning today will face threats we can barely imagine," explained Major Patricia Wells, who oversaw the Academy's Strategic Studies program. "Cyber warfare, asymmetric conflicts, humanitarian crises. They need to be prepared for scenarios that didn't exist when we developed traditional military doctrine." Camilla listened intently, impressed by the depth of thought being put into preparing these young people for their future responsibilities. Her conversation with Major Wells was interrupted, however, by the approach of Lieutenant Weatherby, who had apparently been waiting for an opportunity to speak with her privately. "Your Majesty, I hope I might have a moment," Weatherby said, his voice carrying the same presumptuous tone that had marked their earlier interaction. Camilla turned to face him, noting that he had positioned himself to intercept her conversation rather than waiting to be invited to join the group. His manner suggested an expectation that his request would be immediately accommodated, an assumption that she found increasingly irritating. "Of course, Lieutenant," she said, though her tone remained polite rather than encouraging. "I wanted to apologize if my enthusiasm during the inspection was inappropriate," Weatherby began, though his choice of words suggested he didn't fully understand what he had done wrong. "It's just that meeting you represents such a significant moment for someone from a family like mine." The phrase, "a family like mine," immediately raised red flags for Camilla. She had encountered this particular form of social climbing throughout her adult life. People who assumed that shared class background created automatic intimacy or understanding. Weatherby's apology was revealing itself to be less about acknowledging a mistake and more about establishing his credentials for special treatment. "I appreciate your dedication to service," Camilla replied diplomatically, hoping to end the conversation before it became more problematic. But Weatherby apparently interpreted her response as encouragement to continue. "Perhaps when I return from my posting, there might be an opportunity to continue our conversation. My family has always been deeply involved in supporting the monarchy, and I believe there could be ways for me to contribute beyond my regular military duties." The audacity of the suggestion left Camilla momentarily speechless. Here was a young officer, minutes after admitting to a breach of protocol, suggesting that his family connections entitled him to special access to the royal family. The presumption was breathtaking, even by the standards she had experienced among the most entitled members of British society. Major Wells, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, stepped forward diplomatically. "Lieutenant Weatherby, I believe your platoon commander was looking for you earlier. Perhaps you should check in before the evening meal." Weatherby's face showed a flash of irritation at being dismissed, but military protocol required him to acknowledge the suggestion from a senior officer. "Of course, Major. Your Majesty, thank you for your time." As he walked away, Camilla exchanged glances with Major Wells, both women understanding without words that they had just witnessed a display of entitlement that had no place in a professional military environment. "I apologize for that interruption," Major Wells said quietly. "Lieutenant Weatherby is enthusiastic, but sometimes his enthusiasm outpaces his judgment. Has he displayed this kind of behavior before?" Camilla asked, genuinely curious about how the Academy dealt with officers who showed signs of problematic attitudes. "There have been some concerns about his assumption that his family background entitles him to special consideration," Wells admitted. "We try to address these issues through mentoring and clear feedback about professional expectations." The conversation was cut short by the arrival of Brigadier Harrison, who approached with barely concealed concern visible in his expression. "Your Majesty, I wonder if we might speak privately for a moment." Camilla excused herself from the group and followed Harrison to a quiet corner of the reception room. His manner suggested that whatever he needed to discuss was both urgent and sensitive. "I'm afraid we may have a situation developing," Harrison began carefully. "Lieutenant Weatherby has been speaking with several guests about his conversation with you, and his description of the interaction is embellished." "In what way?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He's suggesting that you expressed particular interest in his family's service record and indicated a desire to continue your association after his commissioning," Harrison explained, his discomfort with having to relay this information clearly visible. The implication was clear. Weatherby was using his brief interaction with Camilla to create a narrative of special royal favor that could enhance his social standing and potentially advance his career through connections rather than merit. It was exactly the kind of behavior that undermined both military professionalism and the integrity of royal engagements. "I see," Camilla said, her voice calm despite her growing anger. "What do you recommend we do about this?" "With your permission, I'd like to have a very direct conversation with Lieutenant Weatherby about the importance of accurate representation of official interactions," Harrison replied. "His behavior reflects poorly on the Academy and could create complications for future royal visits." Camilla agreed to Harrison's suggestion, but she found herself thinking about larger implications of the incident. This young man's behavior represented a troubling attitude toward authority and privilege that seemed to be becoming more common among certain segments of British society. The assumption that family background automatically conferred special access or consideration was exactly the kind of thinking that the military was supposed to overcome through its emphasis on merit and service. As the reception continued, Camilla made an effort to engage with other cadets and their families, wanting to ensure that the positive aspects of the day weren't overshadowed by one individual's inappropriate behavior. She was particularly impressed by conversations with several cadets from diverse backgrounds who spoke passionately about their commitment to service and their gratitude for the opportunities the military provided. The contrast between these dedicated young officers and Weatherby's entitled attitude reinforced her growing conviction that something needed to be done to address his behavior more directly than a simple conversation with his commanding officer would accomplish. The day concluded with a formal dinner in the Academy's Great Hall, during which Camilla delivered a speech praising the graduating class and emphasizing the importance of service, honor, and humility in military leadership. Her words, while directed to the entire assembly, carried particular resonance for those who had witnessed the earlier incidents with Weatherby. True leadership, she said, comes not from privilege or position, but from dedication to something greater than ourselves. The uniform you wear tomorrow represents a commitment to serve others, not to advance personal interests. As the evening ended and Camilla prepared to return to Windsor, she reflected on the complexities of her new role and the unexpected challenges it presented. The day had begun as a straightforward ceremonial duty and evolved into something much more complicated, forcing her to navigate issues of protocol, privilege, and proper military conduct. The interaction with Weatherby had left her with a nagging sense that this wouldn't be the end of the story. His behavior suggested someone who didn't easily accept correction or adapt to feedback, traits that could lead to more serious problems in the future. She made a mental note to follow up with Brigadier Harrison about the young man's progress and any further incidents that might arise. More broadly, the day had given her insight into the challenges facing modern military leadership and the ongoing tension between traditional hierarchies and contemporary expectations of accountability and merit-based advancement. Her role as Queen Consort would require her to navigate these complexities with wisdom and grace, supporting the institution while addressing problematic behaviors that could undermine its effectiveness. As her car pulled through the gates of Windsor Castle, Camilla felt both exhausted and energized by the day's events. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight she could reflect on what she had learned about leadership, privilege, and the delicate balance required to maintain both tradition and progress in British institutions. The encounter with Lieutenant Weatherby had been unpleasant, but it had also clarified for her the importance of addressing problematic attitudes directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. In her new role, she would have many opportunities to influence the culture and values of the institution she represented, and she was determined to use that influence wisely and effectively. 3 weeks after the Sandhurst ceremony, Camilla found herself facing an unexpected development that would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The morning began routinely enough. She was reviewing correspondence in her private study at Clarence House when her private secretary, Margaret Thornton, knocked on the door with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid we have a rather delicate situation," Margaret began, holding a thick folder that appeared to contain newspaper clippings and official correspondence. "It concerns Lieutenant Weatherby from the Sandhurst ceremony." Camilla set down her reading glasses and gestured for Margaret to continue, though her heart sank as she suspected what might be coming. "It appears that Lieutenant Weatherby has been giving interviews to society magazines and newspapers about his interaction with you at Sandhurst," Margaret explained, opening the folder to reveal several glossy magazine spreads. "He's claiming that you expressed particular interest in his family's military heritage and suggested ongoing communication." The magazine spread across Camilla's desk painted a disturbing picture. "Rising military star catches royal eye," read one headline, accompanied by a photo of Weatherby in his dress uniform. Another article titled, "The New Generation of Royal Favorites," suggested that Camilla was cultivating relationships with young officers from prominent families, using Weatherby as the primary example. What made the situation particularly troubling was the level of detail in Weatherby's accounts. He described conversations that had never taken place, quoted words Camilla had never spoken, and created an entirely fictional narrative of royal interest and encouragement. The articles painted him as a specially chosen representative of Britain's military future, personally selected by the Queen Consort for his exceptional qualities and family heritage. "This is completely fabricated," Camilla said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I barely spoke to the young man, and certainly never suggested any kind of ongoing relationship. I'm afraid it gets worse, Margaret continued, producing additional documents. He's apparently been using these media appearances to secure invitations to high-profile social events. Several hostesses have contacted us asking for confirmation of his supposed royal favor. The implications were staggering. Weatherby was essentially using Camilla's name and reputation to advance his social standing and career prospects, trading on a completely fictional relationship to open doors that his actual achievements couldn't access. It was a form of fraud that struck at the very heart of royal protocol and public trust. What does Brigadier Harrison say about this? Camilla asked, knowing that the military leadership would be as concerned as she was about an officer misrepresenting official interactions. He's furious, Margaret replied. Apparently, Weatherby has been equally creative in describing his military achievements to these publications. Some of the training records he's claimed don't even exist. The situation was complicated by the fact that directly contradicting Weatherby's claims would require the royal household to issue public statements about private interactions, something they generally avoided. Yet allowing his fabrications to stand unchallenged could set a dangerous precedent and encourage similar behavior from others seeking to exploit brief royal encounters. Camilla spent the morning reviewing options with her advisors, including legal counsel and media relations specialists. The consensus was that Weatherby's behavior constituted a serious breach of both military discipline and general standards of conduct, but addressing it publicly could create more problems than it solved. The last thing we want is a media circus about the Queen Consort's interactions with junior military officers, explained Sir Robert Chun, her senior advisor. It would only amplify Weatherby's claims and potentially inspire copycat behavior from others. The preferred approach was to work through military channels, allowing Brigadier Harrison to address Weatherby's conduct through official disciplinary procedures while the royal household dealt quietly with the social and media implications of his claims. By afternoon, however, the situation had escalated further. Weatherby had apparently scheduled appearances at two prominent London society events that evening, where he was expected to regale audiences with stories of his royal connections. The hosts of these events included influential figures in politics and business who could potentially be misled by his fabrications. We can't allow him to continue this charade, Camilla told her staff. It's not just about protecting my reputation. It's about maintaining the integrity of royal engagements and military protocols. The decision was made to take more direct action. Sir Robert contacted the hosts of that evening's events to discreetly clarify that Lieutenant Weatherby had no special relationship with the Queen Consort, and that any claims to the contrary were unauthorized and inaccurate. Meanwhile, Brigadier Harrison was asked to expedite whatever disciplinary proceedings were appropriate for an officer who had misrepresented official interactions. But Weatherby proved more resilient and resourceful than anyone had anticipated. When confronted by his commanding officers about the media appearances, he maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that any misunderstanding was the result of journalistic exaggeration rather than deliberate misrepresentation on his part. I simply shared my enthusiasm about meeting Her Majesty, he told Major Wells during a disciplinary meeting. If others interpreted my comments as suggesting special favor, that's their assumption, not my claim. This response revealed a cunning that his earlier behavior had only hinted at. Weatherby had been careful to phrase his media interviews in ways that suggested royal interest without making explicit false claims that could be easily disproven. He relied on implication and innuendo rather than direct lies, making it difficult to pursue formal charges of misconduct. The evening's society events proceeded with Weatherby in attendance, though the host's advanced knowledge of the situation meant his reception was cooler than he had anticipated. Still, he managed to work the rooms effectively, charming older guests with stories of military life and royal encounters that skirted the edge of truth without crossing into outright falsehood. Lady Patricia Worthington, hosting one of the evening's gatherings, later described Weatherby's performance to friends as masterfully manipulative. He had a gift for allowing others to draw the conclusions he wanted while maintaining plausible deniability about his actual claims. Meanwhile, Camilla found herself dealing with the broader implications of the situation. If Weatherby could exploit a brief ceremonial interaction so effectively, what did that suggest about the vulnerability of future royal engagements? How could she continue to meet with military personnel and other officials without creating opportunities for similar manipulation? The answer, her advisors suggested, lay in implementing more structured protocols for royal visits and interactions. Future ceremonies would include clearer guidelines about appropriate conduct and communication, with consequences for violations made explicit in advance. We need to treat this as a learning experience, Sir Robert advised. Weatherby may be an extreme case, but he's shown us weaknesses in our current procedures that could be exploited by others. The next morning brought fresh complications. Several newspapers had picked up on Weatherby's society appearances and were beginning to investigate his claims more thoroughly. While most reputable publications would verify their information before printing anything substantial, the tabloid press was already running speculative pieces about Queen Camilla's military favorites that treated Weatherby's fabrications as established fact. The royal household's press office found itself in the delicate position of correcting misinformation without appearing to attack a junior military officer publicly. Their statements emphasized that Her Majesty meets with hundreds of military personnel in her official capacity and does not maintain private relationships with individual officers, while avoiding specific mention of Weatherby. But Weatherby had apparently anticipated this response. When contacted by journalists about the royal household's clarifications, he expressed surprise and disappointment that his genuine appreciation for Her Majesty's interest had been mischaracterized by officials who weren't present during our interaction. This response was particularly infuriating because it suggested that Camilla's own staff were either misinformed about her activities or deliberately misrepresenting her relationships. It painted him as a victim of bureaucratic misunderstanding rather than acknowledging any inappropriate behavior on his part. He's very good at this, Margaret observed during an afternoon briefing. Everything he says is technically defensible while being completely misleading in its overall effect. The situation reached a turning point when one of Weatherby's fellow officers from Sandhurst contacted Brigadier Harrison with concerns about his behavior. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the young woman Camilla had spoken with during the inspection, had been disturbed by Weatherby's boasts about royal favor and felt obligated to report what she had actually witnessed during the ceremony. His interaction with Her Majesty lasted maybe 30 seconds, Mitchell told Harrison. She was polite, but clearly uncomfortable with his presumption in breaking protocol. There was certainly nothing that could be interpreted as special interest or encouragement. This first-hand account from a credible witness provided the military authorities with the evidence they needed to pursue more serious disciplinary action. Weatherby's claims weren't just misleading. They were demonstrably false when compared with the observations of other officers who had been present. Armed with Mitchell's testimony and similar accounts from other witnesses, Harrison scheduled a formal disciplinary hearing for the following week. The charges would include conduct unbecoming an officer, misrepresentation of official interactions, and bringing the service into disrepute through unauthorized media appearances. When informed of the impending hearing, Weatherby's response revealed the full extent of his arrogance and sense of entitlement. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to clarify his earlier statements, he expressed outrage that his patriotic enthusiasm was being treated as misconduct. "I've done nothing but express my dedication to the crown and my pride in serving under Her Majesty's recognition," he told his assigned legal counsel. If that's now considered inappropriate, then perhaps the military has lost sight of its fundamental purpose. This response demonstrated that Weatherby still didn't understand, or chose not to acknowledge, what he had done wrong. His conflation of personal ambition with patriotic duty showed a fundamental misunderstanding of military values and professional conduct. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. For the military authorities, the goal was not just to address Weatherby's specific misconduct, but to send a clear message about the importance of honesty and integrity in representing official interactions. For Weatherby, the hearing represented an opportunity to defend his actions and possibly salvage his military career. His strategy appeared to focus on portraying himself as an enthusiastic young officer whose words had been misinterpreted by jealous colleagues and overzealous bureaucrats. Meanwhile, Camilla found herself reflecting on the broader lessons of the situation. Weatherby's behavior was extreme, but it highlighted ongoing tensions within British society about class, privilege, and merit-based advancement. His assumption that family background entitled him to special treatment represented attitudes that many institutions were still struggling to address. The incident also raised questions about the role of traditional hierarchies in modern Britain. While respect for authority and protocol remained important, how could institutions distinguish between genuine reverence and manipulative opportunism? Weatherby had exploited the very values that made royal ceremonies meaningful, using respect for tradition as a cover for personal advancement. These reflections led Camilla to consider what changes might be needed in how royal engagements were conducted. Perhaps more structured interactions would reduce opportunities for misinterpretation or exploitation. Clearer guidelines about appropriate conduct and communication could help prevent future incidents while preserving the genuine connections that made such events valuable. The weekend before Weatherby's disciplinary hearing brought an unexpected development that would significantly impact the proceedings. An investigative journalist named David Harper, working for a respected newspaper, had been researching Weatherby's background and discovered a pattern of similar behavior dating back to his university years. Harper's investigation revealed that Weatherby had previously claimed relationships with prominent political figures, academic leaders, and social celebrities based on brief encounters at public events. In each case, he had parlayed minimal contact into suggestions of special favor or ongoing association, using these claims to advance his social standing and career prospects. He's essentially a professional name-dropper, Harper explained to his editors. But he's remarkably sophisticated in how he constructs these false relationships. He never makes claims that can be easily disproven, but he creates impressions that serve his purposes just as effectively. The pattern revealed by Harper's investigation suggested that Weatherby's exploitation of his Camilla encounter was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a deliberate strategy for social and professional advancement. This information would be crucial evidence in the upcoming disciplinary hearing, demonstrating that his behavior represented a fundamental character issue rather than a simple mistake. When Harper's article was published on Sunday morning, it created a sensation that extended far beyond military circles. The detailed account of Weatherby's history of fabricated relationships exposed him as someone who had built his entire social identity on false claims and manipulated associations. The public reaction was swift and harsh. Social media filled with commentary condemning Weatherby's behavior and expressing support for Queen Camilla. Many veterans and serving military personnel spoke out about the damage such conduct did to the reputation of the armed forces and the importance of maintaining integrity in all official interactions. By Monday evening, Weatherby's position had become untenable. The combination of witness testimony from fellow officers, evidence of his media misrepresentations, and the revelations about his pattern of similar behavior created an overwhelming case for serious disciplinary action. His legal counsel advised him to consider resigning his commission rather than facing the disciplinary hearing, which would likely result in dismissal and a permanent mark on his military record. A voluntary resignation would allow him to maintain some dignity and possibly pursue alternative career paths without the stigma of being drummed out of the service. But Weatherby's response to this advice revealed that he still didn't fully grasp the seriousness of his situation or the extent to which his behavior had undermined his credibility. He continued to maintain that he had done nothing wrong and that he was being persecuted for his enthusiasm and family heritage. "They're trying to destroy me because I represent traditional values and genuine patriotism," he told friends. "This is about class warfare and jealousy, not professional misconduct." This delusional assessment of his situation suggested that Weatherby was either incapable of honest self-reflection or so committed to his fabricated narrative that he couldn't abandon it even when faced with overwhelming evidence of its falsity. As Tuesday's disciplinary hearing approached, the case had evolved from a simple matter of protocol violation into a broader examination of integrity, accountability, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and institutional values. The outcome would send important messages not just about military discipline, but about the standards expected of those who serve in positions of public trust. The disciplinary hearing convened at precisely 0900 hours on Tuesday morning in the austere conference room of Sandhurst's administrative building. Brigadier Harrison presided over a panel that included 2 fellow brigadiers, a colonel from the Ministry of Defense, and a civilian legal advisor. The setting was deliberately formal, designed to emphasize the seriousness of the proceedings and the military's commitment to accountability. Lieutenant Weatherby entered the room wearing his service dress uniform, perfectly pressed and adorned with the minimal ribbons appropriate to his junior rank. His bearing remained confident, almost defiant, as he took his seat at the defense table alongside his assigned military counsel, Major Patricia Green. Green was known throughout the Army as a competent advocate who didn't shy away from difficult cases, though colleagues noted she seemed less enthusiastic than usual about this particular assignment. The charges against Weatherby were read formally, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, misrepresentation of official interactions, bringing the service into disrepute through unauthorized media appearances, and violation of protocols governing communication with senior officials. Each charge carried serious consequences, ranging from formal reprimand to dismissal from the service. Lieutenant Weatherby, Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. You stand accused of conduct that strikes at the heart of military discipline and integrity. How do you plead to these charges? Not guilty to all charges, sir, Weatherby replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. His legal strategy had apparently been to maintain complete innocence rather than seeking mitigation through acknowledgement of lesser offenses. The prosecution, led by Colonel James Maxwell from the Army Legal Services Branch, methodically presented the case against Weatherby. Maxwell was a veteran of numerous military justice proceedings, known for his thorough preparation and uncompromising pursuit of accountability. He began by establishing the facts of the Sandhurst ceremony and Weatherby's breach of protocol during the royal inspection. The evidence will show, Maxwell told the panel, that Lieutenant Weatherby deliberately violated established protocols during Her Majesty's visit, spoke inappropriately during the inspection, and then exploited that brief interaction to create a false narrative of royal favor and special recognition. The first witness was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, whose testimony about the actual events at Sandhurst provided a stark contrast to Weatherby's subsequent media claims. Mitchell's account was precise and credible, describing how Weatherby had broken formation, spoken out of turn, and created obvious discomfort for both Queen Camilla and the reviewing officers. There was nothing in Her Majesty's response that could be interpreted as encouragement or special interest, Mitchell testified. She was polite, but clearly surprised by his breach of protocol. The interaction lasted perhaps 20 or 30 seconds and was noticeably awkward. Under cross-examination by Major Green, Mitchell remained unshaken in her account. Green's attempts to suggest that Mitchell might have misinterpreted the royal interaction or harbored jealousy toward Weatherby were unsuccessful, with Mitchell's straightforward responses reinforcing her credibility. The second witness was Major Patricia Wells, who had observed the incident from her position with the reviewing party. Wells' testimony was particularly damaging because her proximity to Queen Camilla allowed her to observe the Queen Consort's actual reactions and responses. Her Majesty was clearly taken aback by Lieutenant Weatherby's presumption, Wells testified. Her subsequent interactions with other cadets were noticeably warmer and more natural, suggesting that his behavior had created genuine discomfort. Wells also testified about Weatherby's inappropriate approach to Queen Camilla during the reception, describing his presumptuous manner and suggestions about future communication. Her account painted a picture of someone who fundamentally misunderstood appropriate boundaries and social cues. Colonel Maxwell then introduced evidence of Weatherby's media appearances, including transcripts of interviews and magazine articles that clearly misrepresented his interaction with Queen Camilla. The contrast between the actual events and Weatherby's public descriptions was striking, revealing a pattern of deliberate exaggeration and fabrication. In this interview with Society Today magazine, Maxwell read, Lieutenant Weatherby claims that Her Majesty expressed particular fascination with my family's military heritage and suggested we continue our conversation when circumstances permit. There is no evidence that any such conversation took place or that Her Majesty expressed any such sentiments. The most damaging evidence came from journalist David Harper, who testified about his investigation into Weatherby's background. Harper's research had uncovered a pattern of similar behavior dating back to Weatherby's university years, including fabricated relationships with political figures, academic leaders, and other prominent individuals. What I discovered was a consistent pattern of Lieutenant Weatherby parlaying brief encounters into claims of special relationships, Harper testified. In each case, he was careful to avoid outright lies while creating impressions that served his social and professional advancement. Harper's testimony was particularly effective because it demonstrated that Weatherby's behavior with Queen Camilla was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a calculated strategy for exploiting social opportunities. The evidence included documented instances where Weatherby had used similar tactics to gain access to exclusive events, secure job recommendations, and enhance his reputation among influential circles. Major Green's defense strategy focused primarily on challenging the interpretations placed on Weatherby's actions and statements. She argued that her client's enthusiasm and pride in royal service had been misconstrued by witnesses who might have their own motivations for presenting his behavior in the worst possible light. Lieutenant Weatherby is a young officer from a family with a distinguished tradition of military service, Green told the panel. His excitement about meeting Her Majesty and his pride in that encounter are natural and appropriate. If his words were later misinterpreted by media outlets seeking sensational stories, that reflects their agenda rather than his intentions. This line of defense faced immediate challenges when Colonel Maxwell introduced evidence showing that Weatherby had actively courted media attention and provided detailed accounts that went far beyond simple enthusiasm or pride. Phone records showed that Weatherby had contacted several publications himself, offering exclusive interviews about his royal encounter. This wasn't a case of media misinterpretation, Maxwell argued. Lieutenant Weatherby deliberately sought publicity and carefully crafted narratives designed to enhance his reputation and social standing. The defense also attempted to argue that the charges against Weatherby were excessive given the relatively minor nature of his original protocol breach. Major Green suggested that a simple reprimand would be more appropriate than the serious disciplinary action being pursued. This argument collapsed when confronted with evidence of Weatherby's subsequent behavior and his refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing when initially confronted by his superiors. The panel heard testimony that Weatherby had been given multiple opportunities to clarify his media statements or apologize for any misunderstandings, but had instead doubled down on his claims and expressed resentment at being questioned. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Weatherby himself took the stand in his own defense. Against the advice of his legal counsel, he insisted on testifying, apparently believing that his personal charm and eloquence could overcome the evidence against him. Under direct examination by Major Green, Weatherby presented himself as a dedicated young officer whose patriotic enthusiasm had been unfairly characterized as misconduct. He maintained that his interaction with Queen Camilla had been entirely appropriate, and that any subsequent misunderstandings were the result of media sensationalism rather than his own actions. "I am proud to serve Crown and country," Weatherby testified, "and I was honored beyond measure to meet Her Majesty. If my expression of that pride has been mischaracterized by others, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the sincerity of my dedication to service." However, his testimony quickly unraveled under Colonel Maxwell's cross-examination. Maxwell methodically confronted Weatherby with the evidence of his media statements, showing how his accounts had evolved and become increasingly elaborate over time. Weatherby's attempts to explain these discrepancies were unconvincing, often contradictory, and revealed his continued commitment to maintaining fabricated narratives. "You claim that media outlets misinterpreted your statements," Maxwell pressed, "but these transcripts show you providing specific details about conversations that never occurred. How do you explain that?" Weatherby's responses became increasingly defensive and evasive. He suggested that he might have been misquoted, that his words had been taken out of context, and that hostile witnesses were conspiring to damage his reputation. These explanations required the panel to believe in an elaborate conspiracy involving multiple independent witnesses, journalists, and military officials. The cross-examination also revealed Weatherby's fundamental lack of understanding about why his behavior was problematic. When asked directly whether he understood the importance of accurate representation of official interactions, his answer suggested that he viewed such concerns as bureaucratic pedantry rather than essential elements of military integrity. "Do you recognize," Maxwell asked, "that misrepresenting your interaction with Her Majesty could undermine public confidence in royal engagements and military protocols?" "I think that's an exaggeration," Weatherby replied, apparently unaware of how damaging his dismissive attitude appeared to the panel. The hearing concluded with closing arguments that crystallized the fundamental issues at stake. Colonel Maxwell argued that Weatherby's behavior represented a serious breach of military values that couldn't be excused by youth, enthusiasm, or family tradition. "Military service requires absolute integrity in all official dealings," Maxwell told the panel. Lieutenant Weatherby's fabrication of royal favor and his refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing demonstrate a fundamental incompatibility with the values we expect from our officers. Major Green's closing argument attempted to portray her client as a scapegoat for broader institutional failures. She suggested that if protocols weren't clear enough to prevent misunderstandings, then the blame lay with the system rather than individual officers who might misinterpret their experiences. This argument failed to resonate with a panel composed of senior officers who understood that protocol violations and subsequent fabrications couldn't be excused by claims of systemic confusion. The evidence clearly showed that Weatherby had understood the rules but chosen to ignore them when it served his purposes. The panel retired for deliberation at 1,630 hours, having heard a full day of testimony and argument. The complexity of the case required careful consideration of both the specific charges and their broader implications for military discipline and integrity. While the panel deliberated, news of the hearing had spread throughout the military community and beyond. The case had become a symbol of broader tensions about accountability, privilege, and appropriate conduct in public service. Many serving officers saw it as a test of whether the military would hold all personnel to the same standards regardless of their background or connections. The media coverage was extensive, with most outlets treating the case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media and self-promotion in professional settings. Editorial commentary generally supported the military's pursuit of disciplinary action, recognizing that allowing such behavior to go unpunished would set dangerous precedents. Queen Camilla herself had been kept informed of the proceedings through regular briefings from her staff. While she refrained from any public comment about the case, those close to her reported that she was pleased the military was taking the matter seriously and addressing the broader issues it represented. The deliberation extended into the evening, with the panel carefully reviewing evidence and considering appropriate penalties. The charges were serious enough to warrant dismissal from the service, but the panel also had to consider whether lesser sanctions might achieve the necessary deterrent effect while allowing for the possibility of Weatherby's rehabilitation. At 20:30 hours, Brigadier Harrison reconvened the hearing to announce the panel's decision. The room was packed with military personnel, legal observers, and media representatives, all waiting to hear the outcome of a case that had captured public attention far beyond its immediate participants. Lieutenant Weatherby, Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority and tradition. This panel has carefully considered all evidence presented during these proceedings. We find you guilty on all charges as specified. The conviction was unanimous, with the panel concluding that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated Weatherby's misconduct and his continued refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of his actions. The guilty verdict was just the first part of the panel's decision, however, with the sentence yet to be announced. The panel recognizes the serious nature of these offenses and their potential impact on military discipline and public confidence in our institutions, Harrison continued. Your behavior has brought discredit upon the service and demonstrated a fundamental incompatibility with the values we expect from our officers. The sentence, when announced, was severe but not unexpected given the evidence presented. Weatherby was to be dismissed from Her Majesty's service, forfeiting his commission and all associated benefits. The dismissal would be recorded as services no longer required, a designation that would effectively bar him from future government employment and seriously impact his civilian career prospects. The reaction in the room was mixed. Military personnel generally seemed satisfied that justice had been served and that the institution's integrity had been protected. Weatherby himself appeared stunned by the severity of the sentence, perhaps having believed until the last moment that his charm and family connections would save him from serious consequences. Major Green immediately announced plans to appeal the conviction, though legal experts suggested that the evidence presented made a successful appeal unlikely. The military justice system allowed for such appeals, but the standard for overturning disciplinary decisions was high, particularly when the evidence was as clear as it had been in this case. As the hearing concluded and participants dispersed into the evening, the broader implications of the case began to crystallize. The military had demonstrated its commitment to holding all personnel accountable regardless of their background or connections. The case would serve as a powerful deterrent to others who might consider exploiting official interactions for personal advantage. For Queen Camilla, the outcome provided vindication and closure for an incident that had caused considerable concern about the integrity of royal engagements. The military's decisive action had protected both the institution of the monarchy and the protocols that made such ceremonies meaningful and appropriate. The case had also highlighted the ongoing challenges of maintaining professional standards in an era of social media and instant communication. Weatherby's ability to rapidly disseminate his fabricated narratives demonstrated the need for clear guidelines about appropriate communication and the importance of immediate correction when misrepresentations occurred. As news of the verdict spread throughout the military and civilian communities, most observers agreed that justice had been served and that the case would have lasting positive effects on institutional integrity and accountability. The weeks following Weatherby's dismissal from military service brought unexpected complications that would test both Queen Camilla's resolve and the broader institution's ability to deal with modern challenges to royal protocol. What had seemed like the conclusion of an unfortunate incident was instead proving to be merely the beginning of a more complex and troubling situation. The first signs of trouble emerged when James Weatherby, no longer Lieutenant Weatherby, failed to quietly disappear from public view as most dismissed officers did. Instead, he began what could only be described as a media campaign designed to rehabilitate his reputation and cast himself as a victim of institutional persecution and class prejudice. His initial interview, conducted with a prominent television journalist known for sympathetic treatment of controversial figures, aired on a Thursday evening to considerable public interest. Weatherby appeared polished and articulate, having clearly prepared extensively for the appearance. He wore a well-tailored civilian suit and adopted a tone of wounded dignity that he maintained throughout the hour-long program. "I serve my country with dedication and honor," Weatherby told the interviewer, his voice carrying just the right note of regret without admission of wrongdoing. "My only crime was expressing genuine appreciation for meeting Her Majesty and taking pride in my family's tradition of military service. If that's now considered misconduct, then we've lost sight of the values that make our institutions great." The interview was skillfully conducted to avoid the specific evidence that had led to his conviction while focusing on broader themes of fairness, tradition, and the treatment of young officers. Weatherby presented himself as someone caught between changing institutional expectations and his own sincere commitment to service and monarchy. When pressed about the fabricated conversations with Queen Camilla, Weatherby maintained that any misunderstandings were the result of miscommunication and institutional paranoia, rather than deliberate misrepresentation on his part. He suggested that his words had been twisted by people with their own agendas, and that he had been denied a fair hearing by a military establishment threatened by his traditional values. The interview generated significant public discussion, with opinions sharply divided along predictable lines. Some viewers sympathized with Weatherby's presentation of himself as a victim of bureaucratic overreach, while others recognized the calculated nature of his performance and the serious issues underlying his dismissal. More troubling for royal household officials was Weatherby's strategic decision to frame his case in terms of broader concerns about institutional accountability and class warfare. By suggesting that his prosecution reflected systemic bias against officers from traditional military families, he tapped into existing social tensions that extended far beyond his individual situation. "There's clearly an agenda to marginalize people like me who represent continuity with Britain's military heritage," Weatherby claimed during the interview. "They want officers who are politically correct rather than genuinely committed to crown and country." This narrative proved particularly effective with certain segments of the public who were already predisposed to view institutional changes with suspicion. Weatherby received supportive messages from veterans groups, conservative political organizations, and social media communities that saw his case as emblematic of broader cultural conflicts. The royal household found itself in the difficult position of wanting to correct the record without appearing to persecute a former officer or becoming embroiled in public controversy. Direct responses to Weatherby's claims would only amplify his media presence and potentially legitimize his portrayal of institutional persecution. "We're dealing with someone who's very skilled at media manipulation," observed Sir Robert Chin during a strategy meeting with Queen Camilla's senior advisors. "He's managed to shift the focus from his misconduct to broader questions about institutional fairness and traditional values." The situation became more complex when several prominent public figures began expressing support for Weatherby's position. A retired general who had commanded British forces in Afghanistan wrote an opinion piece suggesting that young officers were being held to impossibly rigid standards that discouraged the kind of enthusiasm and initiative the military actually needed. "When I was a young officer," the general wrote, "we were encouraged to take pride in our service and express our dedication to the crown. If James Weatherby is being punished for exactly that kind of commitment, then we're sending the wrong message to the next generation of military leaders." These interventions, while well-intentioned, demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the evidence against Weatherby and the specific nature of his misconduct. They also provided him with additional credibility and support from respected figures within the military and political communities. Queen Camilla watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing that Weatherby's media campaign was not just about rehabilitating his own reputation, but was potentially undermining public confidence in royal protocols and military justice. His continued presence in the public eye served as a constant reminder of the incident and raised questions about the effectiveness of institutional responses to misconduct. The situation reached a new level of seriousness when Weatherby announced plans to write a book about his experiences, tentatively titled Service and Sacrifice, a young officer's battle for truth. The proposed memoir promised to provide a detailed account of his military career, his interaction with Queen Camilla, and his subsequent treatment by military authorities. Early promotional materials for the book suggested that it would reveal shocking details about institutional bias and the persecution of traditional values within Britain's military establishment. Publishers were reportedly offering substantial advances for what they viewed as a controversial but potentially profitable memoir that would generate significant media attention. The prospect of a book-length treatment of his grievances raised serious concerns for both the military and royal household. Unlike interviews that could be fact-checked and contextualized in real time, a book would allow Weatherby to present an extended narrative that could further distort the facts of his case while reaching a much broader audience. Legal advisors began exploring options for preventing or limiting the publication of material that might constitute defamation or breach confidentiality restrictions that applied to former military officers. However, the legal landscape was complex, and any heavy-handed attempts to suppress the book could backfire by generating additional publicity and sympathy for Weatherby's cause. Meanwhile, Weatherby had begun accepting speaking engagements at private clubs, veterans organizations, and conservative political gatherings. These appearances allowed him to refine his message and build a network of supporters who viewed him as a symbol of resistance against institutional overreach and political correctness. His standard presentation combined personal anecdotes about his military service with broader commentary about the challenges facing traditional institutions in modern Britain. He spoke eloquently about the importance of military tradition, the value of respect for monarchy, and the dangers of allowing bureaucratic concerns to override genuine patriotic enthusiasm. What happened to me could happen to any young person who takes pride in serving their country, Weatherby would tell his audiences. We're creating a culture where caution trumps commitment, and where following rules matters more than showing genuine dedication to the values those rules are supposed to protect. These speeches were carefully crafted to avoid specific false claims while maintaining the broader narrative of persecution and institutional bias. Weatherby had learned from his earlier mistakes and now focused on themes and impressions rather than factual assertions that could be easily challenged. The effectiveness of his rehabilitation campaign became apparent when he began receiving invitations to high-profile social events and political gatherings. Host committees that might once have been wary of associating with someone dismissed from military service now viewed him as an interesting and controversial figure whose presence would generate attention and discussion. Queen Camilla's advisors watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that Weatherby was successfully transforming himself from a disgraced former officer into a celebrity spokesperson for traditional military values. His continued prominence served as a constant challenge to the authority of the institutions that had dismissed him and raised questions about the effectiveness of their disciplinary procedures. The situation became even more complicated when Weatherby began hinting at legal action against the military for wrongful dismissal and defamation. While such lawsuits were unlikely to succeed given the evidence of his misconduct, they would generate additional publicity and allow him to maintain his victim narrative for months or years to come. He's essentially holding the institution hostage, observed Margaret Thornton during one of her regular briefings with Queen Camilla. Every response we make to his claims generates more attention for his cause, but ignoring him allows his version of events to go unchallenged. The royal household found itself caught between the desire to protect Queen Camilla's reputation and the need to avoid actions that could be portrayed as persecution of a former officer. Traditional approaches to managing royal protocol violations were proving inadequate for dealing with someone who had the media skills and determination to maintain a sustained public campaign. As autumn approached, Weatherby's rehabilitation seemed increasingly successful. His social media following had grown substantially, his speaking engagements commanded respectable fees, and his book proposal was generating serious interest from major publishers. What had begun as damage control for a military disciplinary case was evolving into a broader platform for conservative social and political commentary. The transformation was particularly striking given the serious nature of the evidence that had led to his dismissal. Weatherby had managed to shift public attention away from his specific misconduct toward broader questions about institutional fairness and cultural change. This strategic pivot demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of modern media dynamics and public relations that made him a formidable opponent for traditional institutions. Queen Camilla herself had remained publicly silent about the ongoing controversy, following the conventional royal practice of avoiding direct engagement with critics. However, those close to her reported that she was deeply frustrated by Weatherby's continued presence in the public eye and his success in portraying himself as a victim of institutional bias. The situation was complicated by the fact that direct royal intervention would likely backfire by lending additional credibility to Weatherby's claims of persecution. Any statement from Queen Camilla or her representatives would be portrayed as evidence that his criticism had struck home and that the establishment was worried about the effectiveness of his campaign. Instead, the royal household relied on indirect approaches, including briefings for sympathetic journalists and commentators who could provide context about the actual evidence in Weatherby's case. These efforts had some success in maintaining accurate reporting among serious news outlets, but they had less impact on social media and alternative media sources that were more sympathetic to Weatherby's narrative. The ineffectiveness of traditional royal protocol in dealing with modern media campaigns highlighted broader challenges facing the monarchy in an era of instant communication and celebrity culture. Weatherby had demonstrated that a determined individual with basic media skills could challenge institutional authority and potentially undermine public confidence in established procedures. By December, 6 months after his initial breach of protocol at Sandhurst, Weatherby had transformed himself into a recognizable public figure with a substantial platform for promoting his views. His success in rehabilitating his reputation and building a following around his grievances represented a significant challenge to the traditional assumption that institutional authority would ultimately prevail over individual challenges. The case was being studied by royal household officials, military authorities, and government advisors as an example of how traditional approaches to managing protocol violations might need to be updated for the modern era. Weatherby's campaign had revealed vulnerabilities in established procedures and highlighted the need for more sophisticated responses to media manipulation and public relations challenges. Queen Camilla found herself dealing not just with the aftermath of a specific incident, but with broader questions about how royal institutions should adapt to changing media and social environments. The Weatherby case had become a test case for institutional resilience and effectiveness in maintaining public confidence while dealing with determined critics who understood how to exploit modern communication channels. As the year drew to a close, it was clear that what had begun as a simple protocol violation had evolved into something much more complex and challenging. Weatherby's continued prominence and growing influence suggested that the traditional methods for dealing with such incidents might need fundamental revision to remain effective in the contemporary world. The implications extended beyond the immediate case to broader questions about authority, accountability, and the relationship between traditional institutions and modern society. How Queen Camilla and her advisors chose to respond to these challenges would likely influence royal protocol and institutional procedures for years to come. The new year brought an unexpected turn of events that would finally bring the Weatherby affair to its dramatic conclusion. What Queen Camilla and her advisors couldn't have anticipated was that James Weatherby's growing confidence and media prominence would ultimately lead to his downfall through a series of increasingly reckless decisions that would expose the full extent of his deception. The catalyst for this final chapter came in January when Weatherby, emboldened by months of successful media manipulation and growing public support, decided to escalate his campaign by making increasingly specific and dramatic claims about his experiences. His book proposal, now titled Crown and Country: My Battle Against the Establishment, promised revelations that went far beyond his original grievances about military treatment. In the proposal, which was leaked to several media outlets, Weatherby claimed to possess evidence of a broader conspiracy within royal household and military circles to suppress traditional values and silence officers from established military families. He alleged that his case was merely the most visible example of systematic discrimination and suggested that he had documentation to support these serious accusations. The truth about what really happened at Sandhurst and afterward will shock the British public, the proposal declared. The evidence I've gathered reveals a coordinated campaign to destroy not just my career, but the careers of any officer who represents authentic military tradition and genuine devotion to crown and country. These claims represented a significant escalation from his previous narrative of personal persecution to allegations of institutional conspiracy that would, if true, constitute serious misconduct by senior officials. Publishers and media outlets began demanding to see the evidence Weatherby claimed to possess, marking the beginning of a scrutiny that he was not prepared to withstand. The first cracks in Weatherby's narrative appeared when investigative journalists began examining his claims more rigorously. David Harper, the reporter who had originally exposed Weatherby's pattern of fabricated relationships, launched a comprehensive investigation into the new allegations with the support of his newspaper's legal and research teams. Harper's team quickly discovered that many of the documents Weatherby claimed to possess either didn't exist or had been significantly misrepresented. Phone records, meeting notes, and correspondence that Weatherby described as evidence of conspiracy turned out to be routine administrative communications with no sinister implications whatsoever. More damaging still was the revelation that some of the key conversations Weatherby claimed to have witnessed had taken place when he was demonstrably elsewhere, attending training exercises or on leave. His timeline of events contained multiple impossibilities that suggested either deliberate fabrication or a concerning disconnection from reality. What we're seeing, Harper explained to his editors, is someone who has become so committed to his narrative of persecution that he's now creating evidence to support claims that go far beyond anything he could reasonably believe to be true. The investigation also revealed that Weatherby had been secretly recording conversations with supporters, journalists, and potential publishers, apparently planning to use these recordings to support his conspiracy theories. However, when transcripts of these recordings were examined, they showed Weatherby leading conversations and suggesting interpretations that his interview subjects had never actually endorsed. The turning point came in February when Harper's investigation uncovered evidence that Weatherby had been forging military documents to support his increasingly elaborate claims. Using letterhead and formatting copied from legitimate military correspondence, he had created fake memos and reports that he planned to include in his book as evidence of the conspiracy against him. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, but contained errors that were immediately apparent to anyone familiar with military communication protocols. Wrong reference numbers, incorrect formatting, and anachronistic language revealed them as obvious fabrications created by someone with limited access to authentic military documentation. When confronted with evidence of the forgeries by Harper's team, Weatherby initially claimed that he had been provided with the documents by anonymous sources within the military who supported his cause, but feared retaliation if their identities were revealed. This explanation collapsed when forensic analysis showed that the documents had been created on Weatherby's personal computer using software he had purchased specifically for document production. The revelation of the forgeries fundamentally changed public perception of Weatherby's case. Even his most sympathetic supporters found it difficult to rationalize the creation of fake documents as acceptable behavior, regardless of their views about military justice or institutional fairness. Conservative politicians who had previously expressed support for Weatherby quickly distanced themselves from his cause, recognizing that association with document forgery could seriously damage their own credibility. Veterans organizations that had welcomed him as a speaker canceled planned events and removed his endorsements from their websites. The collapse of support was swift and comprehensive. Within days of the forgery revelations, Weatherby found himself more isolated than he had been even immediately after his military dismissal. The carefully constructed network of supporters and allies that had sustained his media campaign for months melted away as people recognized that they had been deceived about the fundamental facts of his case. Publishers who had been competing for rights to his book withdrew their offers, recognizing that the credibility problems would make the memoir unmarketable regardless of its potential for generating controversy. Literary agents who had been courting him stopped returning his calls, and speaking engagements that had provided both income and platform were canceled across the board. Queen Camilla watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. While she was relieved that the truth was finally being recognized publicly, she felt genuinely sorry for a young man who had destroyed his future through a series of increasingly desperate decisions. The situation served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing minor mistakes to escalate into major crises through pride and poor judgment. The final blow to Weatherby's credibility came when several of the people he had claimed as supporters came forward to reveal that he had misrepresented their conversations and positions. Military colleagues, family friends, and even relatives disclosed that Weatherby had been putting words in their mouths and claiming endorsements that had never been given. James asked me general questions about military justice and then claimed that I had specifically endorsed his case and criticized his treatment, explained Colonel Richard Pemberton, a family friend who had served with Weatherby's father. I never said anything that could be interpreted as support for his specific claims, but he represented our conversation as evidence that senior officers believed he had been wrongly persecuted. These revelations completed the destruction of Weatherby's public credibility and exposed the extent to which his entire media campaign had been built on misrepresentation and fabrication. Even former supporters who might have been willing to overlook document forgery found themselves unable to excuse the systematic deception of people who had tried to help him. By March, Weatherby had effectively disappeared from public view, his social media accounts deactivated, and his speaking engagements canceled. The transformation from rising media personality to discredited figure had taken less than 6 weeks, demonstrating how quickly public opinion could shift when confronted with clear evidence of deception. The rapid collapse of Weatherby's campaign provided important lessons for both royal household officials and military authorities about dealing with modern media challenges. His initial success had demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional institutions to sustain public relations attacks, but his ultimate failure showed that truth and evidence could still prevail if properly documented and presented. Queen Camilla commissioned a comprehensive review of royal protocol and security procedures to identify changes needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The review recommended clearer guidelines for public interactions, better training for staff on media management, and more proactive approaches to correcting misinformation when it appeared. The military conducted its own lessons learned analysis, focusing on how to identify and address character issues in young officers before they could escalate into more serious problems. The Weatherby case highlighted the importance of thorough background checks and ongoing monitoring of officers' conduct both on and off duty. In April, Queen Camilla made her first public reference to the Weatherby affair during a speech at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. Speaking to a new graduating class, she emphasized the importance of integrity, honesty, and proper conduct in military service. The uniform you wear represents not just your own honor, but the honor of all who have served before you and all who will serve after you, she told the graduating cadets. That uniform demands absolute integrity in all your dealings, both professional and personal. Any compromise of that integrity diminishes not just yourself, but the institution you serve and the values you represent. The speech was widely interpreted as a reference to the Weatherby case, though Queen Camilla never mentioned him by name. Her words carried particular weight because they came from someone who had directly experienced the consequences of an officer's failure to maintain appropriate standards. The graduating class responded to her message with obvious appreciation and understanding. These young officers had followed the Weatherby case closely and understood the importance of maintaining the military's reputation for integrity and professionalism. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, who had been promoted and was now serving with distinction in Cyprus, later wrote to Queen Camilla expressing gratitude for her clear statement of expectations and values. Your words reminded all of us why we chose to serve and what we must never allow ourselves to become, Mitchell wrote. By summer, the Weatherby affair had largely faded from public memory, though it continued to influence policy and procedure within royal and military circles. The case had become a standard example in military ethics training, illustrating how small compromises of integrity could escalate into career-destroying crises. Weatherby himself had retreated to private life, reportedly working in his family's business while avoiding any public role or media attention. Those who encountered him described him as a chastened figure who seemed to finally understand the magnitude of his mistakes and their consequences. The lasting impact of the case extended beyond its immediate participants to broader questions about authority, accountability, and truth in public life. Weatherby's initial success in building support through media manipulation had demonstrated the fragility of institutional authority in the modern era, while his ultimate downfall had shown that sustained deception could not indefinitely survive determined investigation. Queen Camilla reflected on these lessons during quiet moments at Clarence's house, recognizing that her role as queen consort would continue to present unexpected challenges that would require both traditional wisdom and modern adaptability. The Weatherby case had been an education in the complexities of contemporary public life and the ongoing need to defend institutional values while adapting to changing circumstances. The young officers she met at subsequent military ceremonies seemed to understand the significance of what had transpired and the importance of maintaining the highest standards of conduct. Their professionalism and dedication provided reassurance that the military's commitment to integrity remained strong despite the challenges posed by individuals who sought to exploit their positions for personal advantage. As autumn returned and another year of royal duties began, Queen Camilla could look back on the Weatherby affair as a difficult but ultimately successful defense of institutional integrity. The case had tested both royal protocol and military justice in ways that neither had anticipated, but both had proven resilient enough to withstand the challenge and emerge stronger. The lessons learned would continue to influence how such situations were handled in the future, ensuring that the experience had not been wasted but had contributed to the ongoing evolution of institutions that were both traditional and adaptable. Queen Camilla had navigated her first major protocol crisis with dignity and effectiveness, establishing her credibility as someone who could defend royal values while dealing wisely with modern challenges. The story of James Weatherby had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing ambition and entitlement to override integrity and judgment. For Queen Camilla, it had been an unwelcome but valuable education in the complexities of her role and the ongoing need to protect institutional values in an era of rapid social and technological change. The affair's conclusion marked not just the end of a specific crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter in Queen Camilla's development as a royal figure capable of handling whatever challenges the future might bring. She had learned important lessons about leadership, authority, and the delicate balance between tradition and adaptation that would serve her well in the years ahead.